I am Camille, 35 years old, and until yesterday afternoon, I was the lead mergers and acquisitions executive at Sterling Capital. At 4 o'clock on a Friday, my CEO slid a termination folder across the boardroom table, firing me exactly 24 hours before my $5 million bonus was scheduled to clear. My white brother-in-law smirked from the adjacent leather chair, proudly claiming credit for the historic deal I had single-handedly built. I did not scream or throw a tantrum. I simply signed the property release, handed over my security badge, and told them to check one specific clause in the final contract. An hour later, the company's lead counsel read that clause, went deathly pale, and screamed at the CEO, asking if he had paid me. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever let an arrogant person dig their own professional grave. The heavy glass door of the Sterling Capital boardroom clicked shut with a finality that echoed through the expansive space. It was exactly 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. The sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows cast long shadows across the polished mahogany table. I sat completely still, my posture perfect, facing the two men across from me. Brian Sterling, the CEO and founder of the firm, sat with his hands steepled under his chin. He was a man who wore his wealth and power like a weapon, constantly reminding everyone in the room that he held their livelihoods in his hands. Next to him sat Trevor. Trevor was my brother-in-law, a man whose overwhelming sense of entitlement was matched only by his staggering professional mediocrity. He had married my sister Jada 3 years ago, seamlessly integrating himself into my family's wealthy Atlanta social circles while riding the coattails of my professional network. He worked under Brian at Sterling Capital, a position I had foolishly helped him secure when Jada begged me to help her new husband find his footing. Now Trevor sat in the executive boardroom adjusting the cuffs of his custom suit, wearing a smirk that made my blood run cold. Brian slid a thick manila folder across the smooth wood of the table until it stopped right in front of me. I looked down at the label. It simply read severance. "We are making some strategic changes to the executive structure," Camille Brian said, his voice dripping with that artificial corporate sympathy reserved for people who are about to ruin your life. "As you know, the Apex Tech acquisition is officially entering the integration phase on Monday. We have decided that your role as lead M&A executive is being eliminated due to this restructuring, effective immediately." I stared at the folder, the reality of his words settling over me like a heavy winter chill. The Apex Tech acquisition was not just another deal. It was a multi-billion-dollar tech merger that I had spent the last 14 months building from the ground up. I had negotiated the terms, secured the financing, and personally developed the proprietary valuation algorithm that made the acquisition possible. My contract stipulated a $5 million performance bonus payable exactly 1 day after the integration phase officially commenced. Brian was firing me 24 hours before that money was legally required to hit my bank account. "I see," I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "So you are terminating me without cause 1 day before my performance payout?" Brian shifted uncomfortably, but his arrogant demeanor quickly returned. "It is nothing personal, Camille. You were an excellent face for the preliminary pitches. You got us through the door. But the integration phase requires a more collaborative touch, a steadier hand. We need someone who can smooth over the cultural differences between the two companies." That is where Trevor chimed in, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table as if he owned the building. "Do not take it personally," Camille, Trevor said, his voice laced with mocking pity. "You did a decent job with the initial paperwork, but I have been handling the real heavy lifting behind the scenes. The Apex executives feel much more comfortable communicating with me. They needed a firm, masculine presence to handle the transition. Your management style is just a bit too abrasive for this delicate phase." I looked at Trevor, remembering the countless nights I had stayed at the office until 2 in the morning, fixing his catastrophic financial models, correcting his embarrassing email blunders, and shielding him from Brian's wrath to protect my sister's marriage. He had contributed absolutely nothing to the Apex deal, other than fetching coffee and sitting silently in the back of the room during negotiations. Now he was stealing the credit for the biggest acquisition in the firm's history. Trevor let out a short, condescending laugh. Honestly, this is probably for the best. I will make sure Jada sets a nice place for you at Sunday dinner, since you will have so much free time on your hands now. My parents will be thrilled to see you. Maybe without this job consuming your entire life, you can finally focus on finding a husband instead of scaring every man away with your aggressive attitude. You are 35, Camille. It is time to step back and let the real professionals handle the business while you figure out your personal life. Jada and I are just trying to look out for you. His words were calculated, designed to hit every insecurity my parents had spent years highlighting. My mother and father valued social status, pristine marriages, and country club appearances above all else. Jada, the golden child, with her perfect white husband and her flawless social calendar, was their pride and joy. I was the abrasive, career-obsessed spinster who refused to conform to their high society expectations. Trevor knew exactly how to weaponize my family dynamics, using my parents' disappointment in my single status to justify his theft of my career. I did not scream. I did not throw my coffee cup across the room or demand to know how they could do this to me. Emotional reactions were exactly what they expected. They wanted me to become the angry, aggressive black woman so they could justify their decision to have security escort me out. I refused to give them the satisfaction. Instead, I reached out and opened the manila folder. Inside was a standard termination letter and a property release form. I read every single line of the document with meticulous care, the silence in the room stretching out for 2 agonizing minutes. Brian tapped his expensive pen against the table, clearly annoyed by my lack of reaction. "Are we going to have a problem here, Camille?" Brian asked, his tone hardening. "Because if you intend to make a scene, I have security waiting outside. We are prepared to offer you a standard 3-month severance package, provided you sign a non-disclosure agreement and a waiver of your right to sue." I looked at the documents again. The paper in front of me was not the waiver. It was simply an acknowledgement of termination and a receipt confirming the return of company property. I pulled my Mont Blanc pen from my blazer pocket, uncapped it smoothly, and signed my name on the bottom line of the receipt. I closed the folder and slid it back across the table toward Brian. "No problem at all, Brian," I said softly. "I will not be signing your non-disclosure agreement, nor will I be signing any waiver of my rights. This receipt acknowledges that you have terminated my employment without cause as of today." I reached up to my lapel, unclipped my corporate security badge, and placed it precisely in the center of the mahogany table. I reached into my leather tote bag, pulled out my company-issued laptop, and set it down next to the badge. I stood up, smoothed out the front of my tailored crimson blazer, and looked down at the 2 men who believed they had just outsmarted me. Trevor was grinning openly now, clearly thrilled that I was leaving without a fight. He thought he had won. He thought he had secured a multi-million-dollar future on my back while putting the difficult sister-in-law in her place. "Before you process the final payroll batch on Monday morning, Brian," I said, keeping my gaze locked dead on his eyes, "I highly recommend you ask Valerie to review Addendum 4B of the final Apex Tech integration contract. You might want to read it very carefully before you pop the champagne." Brian scoffed, waving a dismissive hand in my direction. "Valerie reviewed the entire contract 3 weeks ago, Camille. Do not try to play corporate games on your way out the door. The deal is sealed, the ink is dry, and Trevor is taking over the integration. You are done here. Pack up your personal items and leave the premises immediately." I gave them both a tight, polite smile. "Good luck with the integration, Trevor. You are going to need it." I turned on my heel and walked toward the heavy glass doors. I did not look back as I pushed through them and stepped into the bustling executive bullpen. The administrative assistants and junior associates fell silent as I walked past their cubicles. They had seen the meeting on the calendar. They knew what was happening. I did not stop at my corner office to gather my framed degrees or my favorite coffee mug. Those things were meaningless now. I walked straight to the elevator bank, pressed the down button, and stood with perfect posture as the stainless steel doors opened to carry me out of Sterling Capital forever. I walked out of the towering glass building and stepped into the humid Atlanta afternoon. I walked to my car in the executive parking garage, climbed into the driver's seat, and let out a long, slow breath. My hands were perfectly steady. I drove out of the garage and pulled into a nearby drive-thru to order a large iced matcha, feeling an overwhelming sense of calm wash over me. I did not know it at that exact moment, but I would later learn exactly how the detonation occurred back on the 42nd floor. While I was paying for my iced matcha, Brian Sterling had smugly picked up his office phone and called Valerie. Valerie was the firm's lead counsel, a fierce, brilliant African-American woman who had fought tooth and nail to secure her position in a male-dominated industry. She was meticulous, relentless, and completely immune to Brian's arrogant bluster. According to the administrative assistant who witnessed the fallout, Valerie marched into the executive boardroom less than 10 minutes after I left. She was carrying a thick binder containing the final executed copy of the Apex Tech acquisition contract. Brian was pouring himself a glass of scotch from the boardroom cart, while Trevor sat with his feet up on the table already discussing the renovations he planned to make to my old corner office. "What is this about addendum 4B?" Brian had asked Valerie, taking a sip of his scotch. Camille tried to throw out some vague threat on her way out the door. "Tell me you vetted the final draft." Valerie did not say a word. She dropped the heavy binder onto the mahogany table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. She flipped through the hundreds of pages until she reached the very back of the document, locating the specific addendum I had flagged. She placed her finger on the paragraph and began to read the dense legal text. As she read the words silently to herself, Valerie slowly reached up and took off her designer reading glasses. The color completely drained from her face. Her hands began to tremble slightly as she looked up from the paper and stared at the CEO. "Brian," Valerie whispered, her voice tight with absolute terror. "Please tell me you paid her." "Paid who?" Brian asked, lowering his glass, his arrogant smile faltering at the look of pure panic on his lead counsel's face. "I just fired her. We saved the firm $5 million. Trevor is handling the integration." Valerie slammed her hands down on the table, leaning forward as she screamed at the top of her lungs, shattering the professional decorum of the entire executive suite. "You arrogant fool. You did not save the firm $5 million. You just triggered a poison pill. Did you even read the final terms before you signed them? Camille owns the licensing rights." Trevor scrambled to his feet, nearly knocking over his leather chair. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "I read the contract. She is just an employee." Valerie turned her fury on my brother-in-law. "You did not read the addendum, Trevor, because if you had, you would know that terminating Camille without cause voids the entire acquisition." Sitting in my car waiting at a red light, I watched my phone screen light up on the dashboard console. The caller ID flashed Brian Sterling. I let it ring. The light turned green and I accelerated down the avenue. 2 minutes later, my phone vibrated rapidly as text messages began pouring in. I glanced down at the preview screen. They were from Trevor. "Camille, please pick up. What did you do?" "Brian is losing his mind. You need to call us back right now. Please, Camille, answer the phone." I smiled, reached out, and powered my phone completely off. The digital screen went black, silencing the panic emanating from Sterling Capital. I merged onto the highway, adjusting the volume on my stereo to listen to some smooth jazz. The corporate fire was burning perfectly, exactly as I had designed it. Now it was time to head to my parents' estate for Sunday dinner and watch the rest of the ashes fall. The iron gates of my parents' estate in Buckhead swung open to reveal a driveway completely choked with luxury vehicles. Gleaming Mercedes sedans, pristine Porsche SUVs, and custom Range Rovers sat parked along the circular drive, reflecting the warm glow of the gas lanterns flanking the massive front doors. Kenneth and Yvonne, my parents, were hosting their monthly Sunday dinner, an event that functioned less as a family gathering and more as a high society showcase for their elite church friends and fellow Jack and Jill alumni. I handed my keys to the private valet they had hired for the evening, smoothed the lapels of my tailored silk blouse, and walked up the sweeping brick steps. I knew exactly what awaited me inside. I knew the specific brand of suffocating judgment that hung in the air of that house, but tonight the dynamic was going to be radically different. The moment I stepped into the grand foyer, the overwhelming scent of expensive floral arrangements and catered prime rib hit me. Smooth jazz floated from the built-in ceiling speakers, mingling with the loud performative laughter of Atlanta, U.S. upper crust. Before I could even hand my coat to the hired staff, my sister Jada materialized from the formal living room. Jada was the undisputed golden child of the family, a woman who had built her entire identity around being agreeable, perfectly styled, and fiercely loyal to our parents' social ambitions. She marched right up to me holding a crystal flute of champagne, her eyes immediately scanning me from head to toe, looking for a flaw. "Look at your skin," Camille Jada said loudly, ensuring the wealthy church deacon and his wife, standing a few feet away, could hear every word. "Are those stress breakouts at your age? You really need to take better care of yourself. I know things are hard for you right now, but please do not bring your negative energy in here and ruin the mood tonight. Mom and Dad have been looking forward to this dinner all week." I looked at my sister, my expression entirely blank. My skin was flawless, but Jada always needed an angle of attack to establish her dominance. She reached up to adjust her hair deliberately, flashing a massive, blindingly bright diamond tennis bracelet under the foyer chandelier. "Trevor bought it for me yesterday," Jada announced, answering the question I had not asked. "A just because gift. He is just so generous, Camille. It is truly a blessing to be married to a man who knows how to provide and protect. I hope you find that someday, though, you really need to soften up if you want a man to stick around." I did not take the bait. I simply smiled a tight, polite expression and walked past her into the grand dining room. The long mahogany table was set for 24 people. Crystal glasses gleamed under the massive chandelier, and the fine china was placed with geometric precision. The guests were already taking their seats, a sea of wealthy black professionals, judges, surgeons, and old money heirs. At the very head of the table sat my father, Kenneth, holding court. To his right sat Trevor, my white brother-in-law, looking impossibly smug in a tailored navy blazer. Trevor was the ultimate trophy for my parents, a white tech executive who they believed elevated their status simply by existing in their family photos. The fact that he was painfully mediocre at his job was entirely irrelevant to them. I took my assigned seat near the end of the table, far from the guests of honor. As the catering staff began pouring wine and serving the first course of lobster bisque, Kenneth stood up and tapped his knife against his crystal water goblet. The ringing sound brought the entire room to a sudden, respectful hush. My father beamed, puffing out his chest as he looked down the length of the table. "Family and friends." Kenneth boomed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate hard work, dedication, and the beautiful rewards of corporate excellence. As many of you know, our son-in-law Trevor has always been a rising star. But this Friday, he proved exactly why he is the pride of this family. I want everyone to raise a glass to Trevor, who was just officially named the new Vice President of Acquisitions at Sterling Capital." The room erupted into enthusiastic applause. Guests raised their glasses, murmuring their congratulations. Jada leaned over and kissed Trevor on the cheek, glowing under the validation of the room. Trevor stood up, feigning a look of humble gratitude. He raised his hands to quiet the crowd, a practiced, arrogant smile playing on his lips. "Thank you, Kenneth." Trevor said, his voice dripping with false modesty. "It is an honor, truly. The Apex Tech acquisition was a beast of a deal, but I am thrilled the board recognized my leadership during the final push. It takes a steady hand to close a multi-billion-dollar merger, and I am just grateful Brian Sterling trusts me to lead the integration phase." Trevor paused, letting his eyes drift down the table until they locked directly onto mine. He tilted his head, adopting a look of deep, patronizing pity. "And of course I want to acknowledge Camille." Trevor continued, his voice echoing in the silent room. "It is a shame about your departure on Friday, Camille. We all know how much you wanted to stay. But as I told Brian, corporate America just is not for everyone. The pressure can make people defensive, and sometimes a company just has to cut its losses to protect the team environment. Do not worry, though. Jada and I will make sure you land on your feet." Maybe you can take some time off to figure out what you actually want to do with your life." The silence that followed was suffocating. Every single guest at the table turned to look at me, their faces caught between shock and morbid curiosity. Trevor had just publicly announced my firing, framing it as a personal failing, a lack of competence on my part. He was wearing my job title, claiming credit for my 14 months of grueling, relentless work and using it to humiliate me in front of Atlanta elite. Before I could even formulate a response, my mother, Yvonne, gasped, placing a hand over her heart in a theatrical display of maternal disappointment. She looked at me from across the table, her eyes narrowing with harsh judgment. "If you had just learned to be more agreeable and less aggressive, Camille Bryan would not have had to replace you," Yvonne scolded, her voice carrying clearly to every guest in the room. "We have told you for years that your tone is entirely too harsh. Look at Jada. She knows how to support a man, how to navigate difficult conversations with grace. You walk into every room looking for a fight. Trevor has a family to support. He has a wife to take care of. You are 35 years old, completely single, and still trying to prove some ridiculous point to the world." My mother leaned forward, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You took out all those massive loans for Wharton Business School, refusing to let us help you because of your stubborn pride. And for what? Trevor built a tech app right out of college. We gladly paid off his debts when the app failed because we believed in his vision. He learned from his mistakes and adapted. You just bulldoze people. Now you are unemployed, deeply in debt, and embarrassing us in front of our friends. You need to humble yourself, Camille." The absolute audacity of her words hung in the air. She was openly praising the white son-in-law for failing upward on her dime, while publicly tearing down her black daughter for climbing the corporate ladder through sheer brilliance and grit. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, pretending to focus on their appetizers, but I knew they were hanging on to every word. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of the rage burning in my chest. I calmly picked up my silver fork, took a deliberate bite of the baked macaroni and cheese, and chewed it slowly. I swallowed, blotted my lips with my linen napkin, and looked directly into Trevor's eyes. "I am curious about your new leadership strategy, Trevor," I said, my voice steady and perfectly conversational. "Since you are the new vice president running the entire Apex Tech integration, how exactly do you plan to manage the transfer on Monday morning without the proprietary algorithm access keys?" Trevor scoffed, rolling his eyes as he took a sip of his bourbon. "Please, Camille, stop acting like you possess some magical corporate secret. I already spoke to the IT department on Friday afternoon. They are wiping your employee profile and bypassing your biometric security protocols as we speak. The system will be fully unlocked and under my administrative control by 8 o'clock on Monday morning. You really think you are irreplaceable? You are just a former employee who got locked out of the building." I gave him a slow, chilling smile. "I see. So you have not actually read the source code licensing agreement. Good to know." Before Trevor could formulate a snappy comeback to my comment, a loud, obnoxious ringtone shattered the tension in the dining room. It was coming from Trevor Pocket. He pulled out his phone, glanced at the screen, and his chest puffed out with undeniable pride. He looked at my father, then around the table at the wealthy guests, clearly sensing a massive opportunity to show off his newfound corporate power. "Well, speak of the devil," Trevor announced loudly, holding the phone up for everyone to see. "It is Brian Sterling. The CEO must be calling to officially congratulate me on the weekend. Let me just put him on speaker so you can all hear." Jada clapped her hands together in excitement. Kenneth beamed, nodding his approval at his brilliant son-in-law. Trevor pressed the glowing green button on his screen and tapped the speaker icon, placing the phone directly in the center of the formal dining table. "Evening." Brian Trevor said, his voice oozing with arrogant confidence. "I am just sitting here having Sunday dinner, celebrating the big promotion with the family and some close friends. What can I do for you?" The silence that answered him lasted for exactly 2 seconds. And then a sound like a bomb detonating ripped through the speaker of the phone. "Trevor, you absolute idiot! Where is Camille?" Brian's sterling voice was not congratulatory. It was a high-pitched, frantic shriek of pure, unadulterated panic. The sheer volume of his scream made several guests physically flinch. Trevor's arrogant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer confusion. "Brian, calm down," Trevor stammered, glancing nervously at the silent dinner guests. "What is going on? I am on speakerphone with my in-laws." "I do not care if you are on speakerphone with the President of the United States," Brian roared, his voice cracking with hysteria. "The Apex deal just triggered a poison pill. The executives from Apex Tech just called my personal cell phone, threatening to pull the entire acquisition. They said their legal department was notified on Friday at 5 o'clock that the algorithm license is officially voided. They are tearing up the merger and preparing to sue Sterling Capital for a $50 million breach of contract." Trevor's face drained of all color. He looked like he was going to vomit. "What are you talking about?" he croaked. "The IT department is bypassing her passwords." "It is not a password issue, you incompetent fool!" Brian screamed, the sound of breaking glass echoing in the background of the call. "She legally owns the patent. The company that holds the IP is registered to her personal LLC. She just licensed it to us through her employment contract. When we fired her on Friday, the license automatically terminated. You told me she was just a glorified project manager. You told me firing her before the bonus payout would be a clean break." "Brian, listen to me," Trevor pleaded, his hands shaking so badly he had to grip the edge of the mahogany table. "We can fix this. I will call their tech guys right now and smooth it out." "You cannot fix this, Trevor," Brian bellowed. "You are fired. Do you hear me? You are immediately and permanently terminated. Do not even bother coming to the building tomorrow. Security has already boxed up your desk. If you do not find Camille and make her reverse this within the next 12 hours, I am going to bury you in civil litigation until you are bankrupt. Fix this or I will absolutely ruin you." The line went dead with a sharp click. The silence in the grand dining room was absolute. It was a suffocating, heavy quiet so profound that I could hear the gentle hum of the air conditioning unit running through the vents. No one moved. No one spoke. Kenneth sat frozen at the head of the table, his mouth slightly open, the silver carving knife completely forgotten in his hand. Yvonne was staring at the phone on the table as if it had just grown fangs. Jada looked rapidly between her husband and the dead phone, her eyes wide with terror. I slowly reached for my crystal glass, lifting it to the light. I took a long, deliberate sip of the expensive red wine, letting the complex flavors settle on my tongue. I lowered the glass, placed it gently back onto the pristine white tablecloth, and looked directly into Trevor's pale, terrified face. "Looks like your promotion just got revoked," I said. A sharp, theatrical gasp shattered the suffocating silence. My mother, Yvonne, placed her hand flat against her chest, her diamond rings catching the light of the chandelier. She looked at me from the opposite end of the long mahogany table, her eyes narrowing with a familiar, harsh judgment. She did not express shock at Trevor's blatant disrespect. She did not leap to the defense of her own daughter. Instead, she leaned forward, transforming my public firing into a lesson on my personal failures for the benefit of her wealthy friends. "If you had just learned to be more agreeable and less aggressive, Camille Bryan would not have had to replace you," my mother scolded, her voice carrying the practiced cadence of a Southern matriarch delivering a sermon. "We have told you for years that your tone is entirely too harsh for those corporate boardrooms. Look at Jada. She knows how to support a man. She knows how to navigate difficult conversations with grace and charm. You walk into every single room looking for a fight, treating every conversation like a battlefield." My father nodded in solemn agreement, slicing his prime rib, as if my career destruction was merely a matter of bad manners. Jada sat beside Trevor, gently resting her hand on his arm, portraying the perfect supportive wife. "Trevor has a family to support." Yvonne continued, gesturing toward my sister. "He has a wife to take care of and a real future to build. You are 35 years old, completely single, and still trying to prove some ridiculous point to the world. You took out all those massive loans for Wharton Business School, refusing to let us help you because of your stubborn pride. And for what? Trevor built a tech app right out of college. We gladly paid off his debts when the app failed because we believed in his vision. He learned from his mistakes, he adapted, and now he is a vice president. You just bulldoze people. Now you are unemployed, deeply in debt, and embarrassing us in front of our friends. You need to humble yourself, Camille. The absolute audacity of her words hung heavy in the dining room air. She was openly praising her white son-in-law for failing upward on her dime, while publicly tearing down her black daughter for climbing the corporate ladder through sheer brilliance and grit. She had rewritten history right there at the dinner table. She conveniently forgot the late nights I spent tutoring Trevor on basic financial modeling. She erased the fact that my Wharton loans were already paid off by my own massive commissions. To her, Trevor was a visionary who had earned his success, and I was just an angry, difficult woman who had finally gotten exactly what she deserved. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. A few of the older church deacons looked down at their plates, pretending to focus intently on their roasted asparagus. The tension was so thick, it felt like it could shatter the crystal wine glasses. They were all waiting for the explosion. They were waiting for me to raise my voice, to slam my fist on the table, to become the aggressive stereotype my mother had just accused me of being. They wanted a show. I refused to give them one. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of the rage burning deep in my chest. Instead, I calmly picked up my heavy silver fork. I reached over to the porcelain dish of baked macaroni and cheese sitting near my plate. I took a deliberate bite, chewing it slowly, savoring the rich flavor as if I were dining alone in a five-star restaurant. I swallowed, picked up my linen napkin, and gently blotted my lips. I looked directly across the table, bypassing my mother entirely, and locked eyes with Trevor. "I am curious about your new leadership strategy, Trevor," I said. My voice was completely steady, perfectly conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. "Since you are the new vice president running the entire Apex Tech integration, how exactly do you plan to manage the transfer on Monday morning without the proprietary algorithm access keys?" Trevor's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second, but his unchecked arrogance quickly rushed back in to fill the void. He let out a loud, condescending chuckle, shaking his head as he looked around the table to ensure his audience was watching him put me in my place. "Please, Camille." Trevor scoffed, leaning back in his chair and swirling the amber liquid in his bourbon glass. "Stop acting like you possess some magical corporate secret. You always do this. You overcomplicate basic procedures to make yourself seem indispensable. It is exactly why Brian wanted you out. You hoard information instead of being a team player." I rested my hands politely in my lap. "I am just asking a logistical question, Trevor. The Apex valuation algorithm requires a unique biometric key and a master passcode to initiate the data merge. I am no longer an employee. My access is terminated. So how will you merge the servers on Monday?" Trevor rolled his eyes, taking a large, arrogant gulp of his drink. "I already spoke to the IT department on Friday afternoon, right after you left the building. They are wiping your employee profile and bypassing your security protocols over the weekend. The system will be fully unlocked and under my absolute administrative control by 8 o'clock on Monday morning." He pointed a finger at me, his face flushing with the thrill of his own perceived power. "You really think you are irreplaceable, Camille? You think that because you wrote a few lines of code back in the day, the entire firm revolves around you? Sterling Capital has a dedicated team of elite software engineers. They can crack whatever basic password you put on those files in their sleep. You are just a former employee who got locked out of the building. The company moves on without you. I move on without you." Jada let out a soft, mocking laugh from beside him. "Honestly, Camille?" Jada chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "It is a little pathetic that you are trying to hold on to a job you already lost. Trevor is the vice president now. You should be congratulating him instead of trying to play these petty little games. He knows what he is doing." I looked at my sister, watching the way she clung to his arm, completely blind to the fact that her husband was a corporate parasite feeding off my life's work. I looked at my parents, who were nodding along with Trevor, entirely willing to watch my career burn to ashes, as long as it kept their country club image intact. They truly believed I was nothing without Sterling Capital. They truly believed Trevor had outsmarted me. I gave Trevor a slow, chilling smile. It was a smile completely devoid of warmth, a predator baring its teeth. "I see," I said softly, letting the words carry down the length of the silent table. "So you have not actually read the source code licensing agreement." "Good to know." Trevor frowned, his thick brow furrowing in irritation. "What licensing agreement? What are you talking about? I read the entire integration packet." "You read the executive summary, Trevor?" I corrected him, keeping my voice perfectly level. "The IT department can bypass my email password. They can wipe my employee portal. But they cannot bypass a localized algorithm that is hard-coded to recognize my specific biometric signature and encrypted under a private shell company. If they attempt a brute force entry, which I assume your elite software engineers are currently trying to do, the system will automatically initiate a hard lockout. But I am sure the new vice president of acquisitions already factored that into his Monday morning strategy." Trevor stared at me, a brief flash of genuine uncertainty crossing his eyes. For a split second, the facade slipped. He knew deep down that he relied entirely on my expertise to understand the technical architecture of the Apex deal. He knew he had skipped reading the legal addendums because he found them boring. But his ego would never allow him to admit weakness in front of Kenneth and Yvonne. He quickly masked his panic with another dismissive scoff. "You are bluffing, Camille. You are just bitter. The tech team has it under control. I am not going to let you sit here and try to undermine my success with your technical jargon. The deal is secure, and I am the one steering the ship." I simply nodded, taking a sip of my ice water. I did not need to argue. I knew exactly what was happening in the Sterling Capital server rooms at that very moment. I knew the IT department was staring at red warning screens, desperately trying to call Brian Sterling. I knew the trap I had carefully laid months ago, a standard protection clause that Brian was too arrogant to read and Trevor was too lazy to understand, was currently snapping shut. Before Trevor could launch into another defensive insult, a loud, obnoxious ringtone shattered the tension in the dining room. It was coming from the inside pocket of Trevor's tailored navy blazer. Trevor jumped, slightly startled by the sudden noise. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and glanced at the glowing screen. Instantly, his irritation vanished, replaced by an expression of supreme, glowing pride. His chest puffed out. He looked at my father, then looked around the table at the wealthy dinner guests, clearly sensing a massive opportunity to showcase his newfound corporate authority. "Well, speak of the devil!" Trevor announced loudly, holding the phone up for everyone to see. "It is Brian Sterling. The CEO must be calling to officially congratulate me on the weekend. Let me just put him on speaker so you all can hear how much the board appreciates my work." This was exactly who Trevor was. He could never just accept a victory. He had to perform it. He had to rub it in the faces of everyone around him, desperately seeking the validation he could never actually earn through merit. Jada clapped her hands together in delight, practically vibrating with excitement. Kenneth beamed from the head of the table, nodding his deep approval at his brilliant son-in-law. My mother leaned forward, her eyes shining with pride, completely forgetting her anger toward me. Trevor pressed the glowing green button on his screen. He tapped the speaker icon and placed the phone directly in the center of the formal dining table, right next to a crystal candelabra. "Evening," Brian Trevor said, his voice oozing with a practiced, arrogant confidence. "I am just sitting here having Sunday dinner, celebrating the big promotion with the family and some close friends. What can I do for you tonight?" The silence that answered him lasted for exactly 2 seconds. It was the quiet pulling back of the ocean before the tsunami hits the shore. The sharp trill of Trevor custom ringtone sliced through the heavy tension of the dining room before he could even process my words. He jumped slightly in his chair, startled by the sudden noise vibrating against his chest. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored navy blazer and pulled out his phone. He glanced at the glowing screen, and instantly the brief flash of uncertainty I had just seen in his eyes vanished entirely. It was replaced by an expression of supreme glowing pride. His chest puffed out against his crisp white shirt. He looked at my father at the head of the table, then looked around at the wealthy dinner guests, clearly sensing a massive opportunity to showcase his newfound corporate authority to Atlanta high society. Well, speak of the devil, Trevor announced loudly, holding the phone up in the air so everyone could see the screen. It is Brian Sterling. The CEO must be calling to officially congratulate me on the weekend. Let me just put him on speaker so you all can hear how much the board appreciates my work. This was exactly who Trevor was. He could never just accept a victory in silence. He had to perform it. He had to rub it in the faces of everyone around him, desperately seeking the validation he could never actually earn through merit. Jada clapped her hands together in delight, practically vibrating with excitement in her seat. She looked at the prominent neurosurgeon sitting across from her, making sure he was paying attention to her husband's importance. Kenneth beamed from the head of the table, nodding his deep approval at his brilliant son-in-law. He raised a hand, signaling for the catering staff to stop pouring water, demanding absolute silence from his guests. My mother leaned forward, her eyes shining with pride, completely forgetting her anger toward me just moments prior. They were all ready to bask in the glow of Trevor corporate coronation. Trevor pressed the glowing green button on his screen. He tapped the speaker icon and placed the phone directly in the center of the formal dining table, right next to a towering crystal candelabra. Evening. Brian Trevor said, his voice oozing with a practiced, arrogant confidence that made my stomach turn. I am just sitting here having Sunday dinner, celebrating the big promotion with the family and some close friends. What can I do for you tonight? The silence that answered him lasted for exactly 2 seconds. It was the quiet pulling back of the ocean before the tsunami hits the shore. And then a sound like a bomb detonating ripped through the speaker of the phone. Trevor, you absolute idiot. Where is Camille? Brian's sterling voice was not congratulatory. It was a high-pitched, frantic shriek of pure, unadulterated panic. The sheer volume of his scream made several guests physically flinch in their chairs. The prominent judge, sitting 2 seats down from me, actually dropped his linen napkin. Trevor's arrogant smile vanished instantly, completely wiped from his face, replaced by a look of sheer deer in the headlights' confusion. Brian, please calm down, Trevor stammered, his eyes darting nervously around the silent dining room. What is going on? I am on speakerphone with my in-laws and their guests. We are in the middle of dinner. I do not care if you are on speakerphone with the President of the United States. Brian roared, his voice cracking with a level of hysteria I had never heard from the normally composed CEO. The sound of something heavy smashing against a wall echoed in the background of the call. The Apex deal just triggered a poison pill. The executive board from Apex Tech just called my personal cell phone while I was at my country club. They are threatening to pull the entire acquisition. They said their legal department was notified on Friday at 5 o'clock that the algorithm license is officially voided. They are tearing up the merger documents and preparing to sue Sterling Capital for a $50 million breach of contract. Trevor's face drained of all color until his skin matched the pristine white tablecloth. He looked like he was going to vomit right into his half-empty bowl of lobster bisque. What are you talking about? He croaked, his voice barely a whisper. The IT department is bypassing her passwords right now. I told them to lock her out. It is not a password issue, you incompetent fool. Brian screamed so loudly the phone speaker crackled and distorted his voice. She legally owns the patent. Valerie just tore into my office and shoved the final contract in my face. The company that holds the intellectual property for the valuation algorithm is registered to Camille Personal LLC. She just licensed it to us through her employment contract. When we fired her on Friday without cause, the license automatically terminated. We have absolutely no legal right to access the software that makes this entire acquisition function. The guests around the table were completely frozen, their eyes wide with mortification and morbid fascination. They were witnessing the spectacular real-time destruction of my parents' prized son-in-law. You told me she was just a glorified project manager. Brian continued, his rage escalating with every word. You sat in my office and told me that firing her before the bonus payout would be a clean break. You told me you built the financial models and she just presented them. You told me we could save the firm $5 million and slide you into the vice president role without a single hiccup. You lied to me, Trevor. You took credit for her proprietary software, and because I listened to you, Sterling Capital is bleeding out on the floor. Brian, Please listen to me, Trevor pleaded. His hands were shaking so badly, he had to grip the edge of the heavy mahogany table just to keep himself upright. We can fix this. I know we can fix this. I will call their tech guys right now. I will smooth it out with the Apex team. I have a great relationship with them. You cannot fix this, Trevor. Brian bellowed, the raw panic in his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of my parents' dining room. You do not even understand the code. Valerie said the architecture is impenetrable without Camille biometric authorization. You cannot smooth over a $50 million breach of contract with a phone call. You are fired. Do you hear me? You are immediately and permanently terminated. Do not even bother coming to the building tomorrow morning. Security has already boxed up your desk and deactivated your keycard. No, wait, Brian, you cannot do this. Trevor begged, all his previous arrogance entirely evaporated, leaving behind a pathetic, desperate man. I just bought my wife a diamond bracelet. We are building a custom house. You cannot fire me. Watch me, Brian snarled. If you do not find Camille and make her reverse this within the next 12 hours, if you do not beg her to reinstate that license, I am going to bury you in civil litigation until you are bankrupt. I will personally ensure you never work in the financial sector again. Fix this, Trevor, or I will absolutely ruin your life. The line went dead with a sharp electronic click. The silence that descended upon the grand dining room was absolute. It was a suffocating, heavy quiet so profound that I could hear the gentle hum of the central air conditioning unit running through the vents and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. No one moved a single muscle. No one dared to speak. Kenneth sat frozen at the head of the table, his mouth slightly open, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. The heavy silver carving knife he had been holding slipped from his fingers and clattered loudly against his fine-boned china plate, the sharp sound making several guests jump. He stared at Trevor as if the man had just morphed into a monster right before his eyes. Yvonne was staring at the dark phone sitting in the center of the table, as if it had just grown fangs and bitten her. All her high society posturing, all her lectures about grace and corporate etiquette, dissolved into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. Jada looked rapidly between her husband and the dead phone, her perfect makeup unable to hide the sheer terror widening her eyes. Her grip on Trevor's arm had loosened her fingers, hovering in the air, as she realized her entire, perfectly curated life, the new house, the tennis bracelets, the country club status had just evaporated in the span of a 3-minute phone call. The wealthy guests, the people my parents had invited specifically to witness their family triumph, were entirely paralyzed. They stared at their plates, clearly desperate to be anywhere else in the world, yet entirely unable to look away from the catastrophic wreckage of the Sterling family dinner. I did not break the silence immediately. I let them sit in it. I let the humiliation and the terror seep into their bones. I slowly reached for my crystal wine glass, lifting it delicately by the stem. I held it up to the light of the chandelier, admiring the rich ruby color of the vintage Cabernet. I took a long, deliberate sip, letting the complex flavors settle on my tongue. I swallowed, feeling the warmth travel down my throat. I lowered the glass, placed it gently back onto the pristine white tablecloth, exactly where it had been before, and looked directly into Trevor's pale, bloodless face. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for a lifeline that did not exist. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table, and delivered the final crushing blow with total effortless calm. Trevor's face went from a sickly, bloodless pale to a mottled, furious red in the span of 3 seconds. He slammed both of his fists down onto the mahogany table with such violent force that the expensive crystal water goblets vibrated, splashing ice-cold water across the pristine white linen tablecloth. His heavy wooden dining chair tipped backward and crashed loudly against the hardwood floor as he leaped to his feet. "What did you do?" Trevor screamed, his voice cracking under the strain, entirely abandoning the suave, composed executive persona he had spent the last 2 hours cultivating. He lunged forward, leaning over the table and pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "What kind of sabotage did you plant in the system, Camille? Tell me right now before I call the police." The raw, unhinged volume of his voice acted as a starting pistol for the wealthy dinner guests. These were the elite of Atlanta society people who prided themselves on perfect decorum, who spent their entire lives avoiding messy public scandals. They collectively decided in perfect unison that it was time to evacuate the premises. Deacon Thomas cleared his throat loudly, standing up and abruptly adjusting his suit jacket. "Well, Kenneth Yvonne," he muttered, not making eye contact with anyone. "It appears this is a private family matter. We really must be going. The weather is turning." Within seconds, the grand dining room transformed into a chaotic exodus. The scraping of heavy chairs against the floorboards echoed through the house. Wealthy surgeons, judges, and socialites muttered hasty, awkward apologies as they grabbed their designer coats and rushed toward the grand foyer. No one wanted to be associated with the spectacular implosion of Trevor's career. My mother stood frozen at her end of the table, her mouth opening and closing silently as she watched her carefully curated social status walk right out the front door. The heavy mahogany front doors clicked shut, plunging the house into a suffocating, hostile silence, leaving only the five of us in the dining room. Trevor was hyperventilating. He paced back and forth behind his overturned chair, running his hands frantically through his hair. Jada burst into loud, theatrical tears. She looked at her wrist, clutching the massive diamond tennis bracelet Trevor had just bought her, as if someone were about to physically rip it away. "Camille, fix this nonsense right now," my father demanded, his booming patriarch voice finally returning. He stood up, squaring his shoulders, trying to exert the authority he was so used to wielding. "Whatever petty computer trick you played on Trevor, you are going to call Brian Sterling back and undo it. We are not going to let your childish jealousy ruin your brother-in-law career." I did not move. I did not flinch. I calmly picked up my linen napkin, folded it into a neat square, and placed it next to my plate. "It is not a computer trick," Kenneth I replied, my voice completely steady, a sharp contrast to the panic suffocating the rest of the room. "And I cannot simply undo it." Trevor just learned a very valuable lesson about corporate due diligence. When you spend your entire career stealing credit for other people's work, you eventually steal something you do not understand, and it blows up in your face. Trevor stopped pacing. He gripped the back of Jada's chair, his knuckles turning white. "What did you do to the Apex servers, Camille? I know you locked the files. I will have you arrested for corporate espionage." I let out a soft, genuine laugh. "It is not espionage, Trevor. It is contract law. Let me break this down for you, since you clearly skipped reading the legal addendums of the multi-billion-dollar merger you claim to have orchestrated. I did not just manage the Apex Tech account. I wrote the specific valuation algorithm that made the acquisition possible. Apex Tech is a fiercely protective company. They knew Sterling Capital was entirely populated by corporate sharks like you men who talk a big game, but possess absolutely no technical skills. Apex did not trust Brian Sterling, and they certainly did not trust you. They trusted me." My mother scoffed, stepping forward, her face twisted with a mixture of confusion and desperate denial. "Do not be ridiculous, Camille. You are just a project manager. You do not own the company. Brian fired you. That means Trevor is in charge." "No, Yvonne," I said, looking directly at her. "I was the architect of the deal. Because Apex trusted my code and my oversight, they insisted on a very specific protective measure being embedded into the final merger contract. It is called a key person clause." Trevor's eyes widened. The color drained from his face all over again as the reality of that specific legal term hit him. He was mediocre, but he was not entirely stupid. He knew exactly what a key person clause meant. "Yes, Trevor," I said, watching the realization crush him. "Apex explicitly wrote me into the terms of the acquisition. The contract clearly states that if Camille is terminated without cause, removed from the project, or reassigned within 12 months of the finalized integration, the entire merger is immediately nullified. Not only does the deal collapse, but Sterling Capital is automatically liable for a $50 million penalty fee for breach of contract." Jada gasped, her hands flying to her face. $50 million, she whispered, her voice trembling. "Trevor, is that true?" Trevor ignored her, his eyes locked on mine, breathing heavily. "That is impossible," he stammered, shaking his head in frantic denial. The legal department would never approve a key person clause for a mid-level director. You are lying. Sterling Capital owns all intellectual property created by its employees. It is in the standard employment contract. The company owns the algorithm. We do not need you. That is the best part, Trevor, I said, leaning back comfortably in my chair. Sterling Capital does not own the algorithm. I do. My father gripped the edge of the table. What do you mean you own it? You built it while working for Brian. I smiled, shaking my head slowly. Do you remember 3 years ago, Kenneth? I came to you and Yvonne asking for a small loan to start my own tech consulting firm. You laughed in my face. You told me business was a man world and that I should focus on being more agreeable. You refused to give me a single dime, but the very next week you handed Trevor $100,000 to bail out his failing app. My parents stood frozen, their past hypocrisy suddenly dragged into the harsh light of the present. Because you refused to help me, I said, my voice hardening into steel. I had to be smart. I took out a personal loan. I quietly registered my own independent limited liability company. I spent my nights and weekends writing that valuation algorithm entirely on my own time on my own personal equipment. I secured the patent under my LLC. When Brian Sterling recruited me to handle the Apex deal, I did not sell him the software. I brought it with me as a licensed asset. Trevor's legs seemed to give out. He slumped back into the chair beside Jada, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find oxygen. Sterling Capital never owned the intellectual property. I continued, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet room. I legally licensed the algorithm to the firm through my employment contract. The license agreement explicitly states that Sterling Capital only has the right to use the software as long as I am an active salaried employee. When Brian listened to you, Trevor, when he fired me on Friday afternoon to save a few $1,000,000 on my bonus and let you steal the credit, he legally terminated the license. Jada was sobbing openly now, her perfect blowout ruined as she buried her face in her hands. She was mourning the loss of her impending vice president lifestyle, mourning the reality that her husband was not a genius provider, but a fraud who had just destroyed his own life. The moment Human Resources processed my termination paperwork at 5 o'clock on Friday, I explained, watching Trevor completely unravel the biometric security protocols, automatically locked Sterling out of the servers. The license was voided. Apex Tech was instantly notified of the breach. You did not just fire me, Trevor. You fired the only person holding the keys to the kingdom. You handed Apex a legal right to walk away from the table and demand $50 million in damages. But I told Brian we could bypass it. Trevor whispered, his voice sounding hollow, completely detached from reality. I told the board I had the integration under control. And they believed you, I said, offering a cold, victorious smile. Because you wear a nice suit and you know how to play golf. Because you have the right look and the right background. You spent the last 14 months taking my reports, putting your name on the cover page, and presenting them to the board. You thought you could just push me out the door and ride my coattails all the way to the executive suite. But you never bothered to actually read the code. You never bothered to read the licensing addendums. You were so blinded by your own unearned arrogance that you walked right off a cliff and dragged the entire firm down with you. My father, who had spent the last decade treating me like an aggressive embarrassment, was staring at me with a mixture of terror and profound, undeniable respect. He finally saw the predator I had become in order to survive in the corporate world he worshipped. He looked down at Trevor, the golden boy he had praised all evening, and saw nothing but a liability. You are going to fix this, Camille, my mother pleaded, her voice cracking as she abandoned her harsh judgment, suddenly desperate to save her family's social standing. You are going to call Brian. You are going to give them the license back. Trevor is your brother-in-law. He has a family. I slowly stood up from the dining table, smoothing the wrinkles from my tailored silk blouse. I looked at the extravagant spread of uneaten food, the spilled water, the shattered remains of my parents' perfect Sunday dinner. I am unemployed, Yvonne, I said, my voice perfectly calm. I have absolutely no obligation to help Sterling Capital. Trevor claimed he was the mastermind behind the Apex deal. Let us see how smart he really is on Monday morning when the lawsuits hit the front page of the Wall Street Journal. The heavy silver carving knife Kenneth had dropped still lay next to his fine bone china plate, a gleaming testament to the shock that had just paralyzed the room. But the shock did not last. It morphed, twisting into something far more toxic. My father's face turned a dangerous mottled shade of crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his stiff white collar. But when he finally found his voice, he did not turn his rage toward the man sitting to his right. He did not look at Trevor, who was currently hyperventilating and wiping beads of cold sweat from his forehead. He did not demand an explanation for the blatant, humiliating theft of my intellectual property. Instead, Kenneth locked his furious gaze entirely on me. "You vindictive, selfish little girl," my father hissed, his voice trembling with a terrifying, quiet wrath. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the arms of my chair. I watched the man who shared my blood completely ignore the fact that his prized son-in-law had just committed corporate fraud. I watched him bypass the reality that Trevor had lied to the CEO of a major equity firm, stolen my work, and nearly triggered a $50 million lawsuit. In my father's eyes, Trevor's incompetence was not the issue. My refusal to quietly accept being a victim was the only crime committed tonight. "You are going to pick up that phone right now," Kenneth ordered, pointing a heavy finger at the device still sitting in the center of the mahogany table. "You are going to call Brian Sterling back. You will apologize for this absurd misunderstanding. You will tell him that the algorithm license is fully active and that Trevor was absolutely essential to its creation. You are going to fix this, Camille." I looked at him, genuinely marveling at his delusion. "Fix it, Kenneth?" I asked, my voice carrying clearly over Jada-muffled sobbing. Trevor just admitted on speakerphone in front of half of Buckhead elite society that he has absolutely no idea how the Apex software functions. He cannot write a single line of code. He cannot even bypass a basic biometric firewall. How exactly do you expect me to fix his complete lack of intelligence? My mother slammed her hand down onto the table, the impact making her crystal water goblet teeter dangerously. "Do not speak to your father that way," Yvonne screamed, her perfectly manicured composure finally shattering into pieces. She stood up, her expensive silk dress rustling sharply in the quiet room. "You are destroying your sister life out of petty, bitter jealousy, Camille. You have always been jealous of Jada. You have always resented her happiness because no man has ever wanted to deal with your miserable, abrasive attitude." I shifted my gaze to my mother. "My sister life," I asked calmly. "Trevor is the one who lied to his CEO. Trevor is the one who got fired." Yvonne marched around the edge of the table, her heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor until she was standing just a few feet away from my chair. "That vice president bonus was supposed to close the deal on Jada Newhouse tomorrow morning," she yelled, her face contorted with rage. "They are building a custom 10,000 square foot estate in Alpharetta. The earnest money is already in escrow. The builders are breaking ground on Tuesday. They need that bonus to secure the construction loan. Trevor promised Jada the house of her dreams, and you are purposefully ruining it just to stroke your own massive ego." The true motive finally spilled out, raw and ugly. It was never about right or wrong. It was never about justice or fairness. It was about the custom marble countertops in Alpharetta. It was about the country club status. It was about my parents maintaining the illusion that they had successfully married their golden child off to a brilliant, wealthy white tech executive. "We paid for your sister's wedding while you sat in a cramped apartment staring at a computer screen." Yvonne continued, her voice echoing shrilly. "We helped Trevor secure the loans for his first business because he actually had vision. He actually knows how to play the game. You refused our help. You refused to join the debutante cotillion. You refused to network with the right families. You chose to isolate yourself, and now you want to punish Jada because she played the game better than you did. You are going to call Brian and save Trevor's job." Jada lifted her tear-stained face from her hands. Her mascara was running down her cheeks, ruining her flawless makeup. She looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated entitlement. "Please, Camille." Jada whined, her voice nasal and pathetic. What do you even need that job for anyway? You have no husband. You have no children. You live in a condo. Trevor and I are building a legacy. We are starting a family. You cannot take this away from us. It is not fair. You have to give the algorithm back to Trevor. Trevor, sensing the unconditional protection of his in-laws, suddenly found his courage again. He straightened his posture, wiping the sweat from his face with a linen napkin. He cleared his throat, attempting to summon back the arrogant vice president persona that had just been publicly executed. Jada is right, Camille, Trevor said, his voice shaky but gaining momentum. The board of directors at Sterling Capital is already panicked. They will not want to deal with a disgruntled former employee holding their software hostage. It makes the firm look weak, but if I own the intellectual property, I can calm the Apex executives down. I can tell Brian that I secured the asset personally. It is the only way to save the merger and keep my title. I stared at him, genuinely fascinated by the sheer magnitude of his audacity. You want me to give you the algorithm? Yes, Kenneth intervened, his voice dropping into a low, commanding register, the tone he used when closing real estate deals. He walked over and stood beside Trevor, placing a supportive hand on his white son-in-law's shoulder. You are going to sign the LLC over to Trevor. First thing tomorrow morning, we will have the family attorney draft a transfer of ownership. You will assign the patent rights directly into Trevor's name. Once he legally owns the software, he can march into Brian Sterling's office, save the $50 million deal, and demand his vice president rollback. I looked at my black parents, two people who had spent their entire lives fighting through systemic racism to build their wealth, who had lectured me for decades about working twice as hard to get half as far. And here they were, actively demanding that I hand over my multi-million-dollar creation to a mediocre, incompetent white man simply because he married their favorite daughter. They were willing to sacrifice my entire future to protect his fragile ego and their country club reputation. Let me make sure I understand the absolute insanity of what you are proposing, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet volume. You want me to sign over a proprietary algorithm that is single-handedly holding together a multi-billion-dollar corporate merger. You want me to forfeit a patent that is worth a minimum of $50 million on the open market. And you want me to hand it over entirely for free to a man who literally just got fired for stealing my work. We are family, Kenneth stated firmly, his jaw set in stubborn defiance. We protect our own. We do not air our dirty laundry in public, and we do not let our family members lose their livelihoods over a petty squabble. You are going to do the right thing for your sister. You protect him, I corrected, my eyes locking onto my father. You never protected me. You spent my entire life calling me difficult and aggressive because I refused to smile and nod while people walked all over me. You watched Trevor take credit for my financial models for 14 months, and you applauded him for it. You sat at this very table 10 minutes ago and praised him for firing me. That was business, Camille, my mother snapped, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. Trevor had to make a tough executive decision to streamline the department. You are making this personal. I stood up slowly, pushing my heavy dining chair back. I smoothed the lapels of my silk blouse, looking at the four of them. They looked like a pathetic portrait of desperate entitlement. It is entirely personal, Yvonne, I said smoothly. But you are missing the most crucial detail of contract law. I walked slowly around the edge of the table, my heels echoing sharply against the hardwood floor, until I was standing directly behind Trevor's chair. I leaned down slightly, bringing my face close to his ear. He flinched, his shoulders tensing under his expensive blazer. Do you really think Brian Sterling is an idiot, Trevor? I asked softly. Brian just found out you lied to his face for over a year. He just found out you have absolutely no idea how the Apex algorithm works. Even if I magically signed the LLC over to you tomorrow morning, do you honestly believe Brian would reinstate your vice president title? You are a massive liability. The moment you walk into that building, Brian will bury you in civil litigation just for the thrill of it. You are dead in the water in the financial sector. Trevor swallowed hard, a visible tremor running through his neck. I can manage, Brian, he muttered weakly. I just need the patent. Kenneth took a threatening step toward me, his face dark with fury. "You will sign the paperwork tomorrow morning, Camille, or I swear to God you are no longer welcome in this family. I will cut you out of the will. I will make sure every single connection I have in Atlanta knows exactly how selfish and unstable you are. You will never find work in this city again." I looked at my father, feeling a strange, hollow sense of finality. The threat of losing this toxic family was not a punishment. It was a liberation. "Keep your inheritance, Kenneth," I said, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. "I do not need it." Because while Trevor was busy picking out diamond bracelets and planning custom swimming pools in Alpharetta, with money he had not actually earned, I was busy securing my own future. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I unlocked the screen and tapped on an email I had received 30 minutes before arriving at the estate. I held the phone up, turning the screen so Kenneth, Yvonne, Jada, and Trevor could clearly see the official corporate letterhead glowing brightly in the dim dining room. "I am not giving Trevor the LLC," I announced, watching their eyes widen as they read the bold text at the top of the screen. Because Brian Sterling did not just call Trevor tonight to fire him, he also called my private attorney 2 hours ago. Sterling Capital just offered to buy my LLC outright to save the Apex merger. They are purchasing my algorithm for $65 million in cash. And part of my strict conditions for the sale is that Trevor Blackwood is permanently blacklisted from ever stepping foot on Sterling Capital property again. Kenneth stared at the glowing screen of my phone, his eyes tracing the bold corporate letterhead of Sterling Capital. For a long, suffocating moment, the astronomical figure of $65 million seemed to short-circuit his brain. But Kenneth was a man whose entire identity was forged in absolute, unquestioned authority. His shock quickly curdled into a violent, desperate rage. He simply refused to accept that his scapegoat daughter had completely outplayed his golden son-in-law. He slapped his hand down onto the mahogany table, rattling the fine china. "You are bluffing," Kenneth growled, his voice vibrating with a terrifying quiet wrath. "I know exactly how you operate, Camille. You are trying to intimidate us. You are going to pick up your phone, call your lawyer, and void that sale right this second. You are going to sign that LLC over to Trevor, or I swear on my life you are completely finished in this family. You will be dead to us." My mother rushed to back him up, her eyes wide with a manic desperation. "You are a disgrace to the family name, Camille," Yvonne shrieked, her Southern Belle composure entirely abandoned. "You are destroying your sister's life out of petty, bitter jealousy. Trevor needs that vice president bonus tomorrow morning. That bonus is the only way they are closing escrow on the custom build in Alpharetta. The builders are breaking ground on Tuesday. You are snatching the house of your sister dreams right out of her hands because you cannot stand to see her happy." I looked at my parents, feeling a strange, hollow sense of absolute clarity. They were fully prepared to disown their own black daughter, to cast me out into the street, and actively sabotage my career, all to protect the fragile ego of a white man who had manipulated his way into their bank accounts. They prioritized his unearned success over my self-made millions. I pushed my heavy dining chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. I stood up to my full height, smoothing the front of my silk trousers. I did not raise my voice to match their hysterical shouting. I simply walked over to the antique coat rack standing in the corner of the grand dining room. I pulled my tailored trench coat from the brass hook and slowly slipped my arms into the sleeves. I turned back to face the table, buttoning my coat with deliberate, agonizing precision. I looked directly at my mother, whose face was flushed with self-righteous fury. "Trevor Vice President Bonus was never going to buy Jada a custom house in Alpharetta, Mom," I said, my voice echoing crisply in the cavernous room. Jada blinked, her tear-stained face snapping up to look at me. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "We signed the contract. We picked out the marble countertops. There is no house." "Jada," I said, shifting my gaze to my sister. "There is no escrow. There is no construction loan." I turned my attention back to my parents. Trevor was not relying on that Sterling Capital bonus to build a real estate legacy. I projected my voice, so every syllable landed like a physical blow. That bonus was supposed to quietly replace the $300,000 Trevor embezzled from your private retirement accounts last November. He desperately needed the cash to keep his failing tech app afloat just long enough to secure the Sterling Capital job. Didn't he tell you? The silence that slammed into the room was absolute, deafening, and suffocating. It was as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the grand dining room. Kenneth's face dropped. He looked at me, then slowly turned his head to look at Trevor. "What did she just say?" My father whispered, his voice trembling with a sudden terrifying frailty. Trevor sat frozen in his chair, his skin taking on a sickly, translucent gray hue. He looked like a man standing on the gallows. He opened his mouth to speak to deny the accusation, but his throat worked soundlessly. No words came out. I did not stop. I stepped closer to the table, ensuring they heard every single detail of their golden boy betrayal. When Brian Sterling assigned me to audit the Apex Tech financials, I also ran a routine background compliance check on all senior executives handling the merger, I explained smoothly. It is standard corporate procedure. I noticed some highly irregular wire transfers originating from a shell company registered in Delaware. Trevor thought he was a financial genius, but his money laundering skills are just as sloppy and incompetent as his software coding. I looked directly at my father, watching the horrific realization dawn in his eyes. I traced the routing numbers, Kenneth. Trevor convinced you to let him manage a portion of your high-yield offshore investments last year, did he not? You handed him the access keys because you believed he was a financial prodigy. You handed him the keys and he immediately siphoned $300,000 directly into his failing startup to cover up his massive debts. He was praying the Apex merger would go through so he could use his vice president signing bonus to quietly replenish your retirement accounts before you ever noticed the money was missing. Trevor's knees literally buckled beneath the table. He tried to push himself up, but his legs betrayed him. He collapsed forward, his hands grasping wildly at the pristine white tablecloth. He pulled the fabric down with him, dragging a heavy crystal water pitcher off the edge of the mahogany table. It shattered against the hardwood floor with a violent crash, sending ice and water splashing across the expensive Persian rug. Trevor hit the floor, gasping for air, clutching his chest, as a full-blown panic attack seized his body. Jada let out a piercing guttural shriek that chilled my blood. It was the sound of a woman watching her entire fabricated reality disintegrate before her very eyes. The perfect illusion of her flawless marriage, her wealthy lifestyle, her effortless superiority over me shattered into a million jagged pieces. She dropped to her knees right into the puddle of ice water and broken glass. She grabbed Trevor by the lapels of his tailored navy blazer, violently shaking him. "Is it true?" Jada screamed, her voice completely unrecognizable, stripped of all its artificial sweetness. "Tell me she is lying, Trevor. Tell me you did not steal their money. Where is my house? Where is my house?" Trevor could only let out a pathetic, whimpering sob, unable to look his wife in the eye. He curled in on himself, a pathetic, broken shell of the arrogant executive who had tried to publicly humiliate me just 20 minutes earlier. I shifted my gaze to the head of the table. Kenneth had turned a terrifying ashen shade of gray. He clutched his chest, staggering backward until his spine hit the heavy mahogany sideboard. His breath came in short, ragged wheezes as he realized his prized white son-in-law did not just humiliate him in front of Atlanta high society, but had actively and systematically robbed him blind. The man he had praised, the man he had elevated above his own flesh and blood, had stolen his hard-earned retirement funds to cover up his own spectacular failures. Yvonne dropped into her dining chair, wailing loudly. She clutched her diamond necklace, her eyes wide with a frantic, uncomprehending horror. She looked at the wreckage of her family, the shattered crystal, her weeping golden daughter, her broken husband, and the fraudulent son-in-law groveling on the wet floor. I did not rush to help them. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I looked at the chaotic ruins of the grand dining room. It was the ultimate visceral representation of their hypocrisy, their greed, and their blinding arrogance. They had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small, trying to force me to shrink myself so they could maintain their comfortable illusions. They had finally pushed me too far, and the consequences had arrived to collect their dues. I turned my back on the hysterical screaming and the sounds of shattered glass. I walked down the long, sweeping hallway, the sharp, confident click of my heels echoing off the walls, easily masking the sound of their crying. I reached the heavy iron wrought front doors. I turned the brass handle and pulled the massive doors open. The cool, crisp Atlanta night air hit my face, smelling of pine needles and impending rain. It was the cleanest air I had breathed in years. I stepped outside onto the sweeping brick steps, leaving the front door wide open behind me, letting the cold wind rush into the estate. I walked down the driveway toward the iron gates, leaving them behind in the ruins of their own making, finally and absolutely free. The sun rose over Atlanta on Monday morning, casting a sharp, blinding glare against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Apex Tech headquarters in Midtown. I was not at home hiding under my covers. I was not screening calls from my furious parents or panicking over the bridge I had just burned to ashes. Instead, I was sitting in a plush leather chair in the ultra-modern glass-walled office of Marcus Vance. Marcus was the visionary chief executive officer of Apex Tech. He was a man who appreciated precision efficiency and, above all else, absolute ruthlessness in business. He stood by his personal espresso machine, meticulously pulling 2 shots of dark roast. He handed me a matte black ceramic cup, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. Marcus had always known Trevor was a fraud. During the 14 months we spent negotiating the merger, Marcus had watched Trevor stumble through basic financial models and deflect technical questions. Marcus had seen right through the tailored suits and the hollow corporate buzzwords. He knew I was the one writing the code, running the projections, and holding the architecture of the deal together. That was exactly why Marcus had insisted his legal team embed the key person clause into the final contract. He wanted to ensure that if Sterling Capital tried to screw me over, Apex Tech would have the leverage to walk away. I took a slow sip of the rich, bitter espresso, savoring the warmth as it traveled down my throat. The quiet hum of the Apex Tech executive floor was a stark, soothing contrast to the hysterical screaming that had echoed through my parents' grand dining room the night before. Right on cue, my laptop resting on Marcus' sleek glass desk chimed with a frantic, repetitive rhythm. A cascade of notification banners flooded the top right corner of my screen. It was a relentless digital assault from Brian Sterling. I opened my inbox to find a barrage of emails, each subject line typed entirely in capital letters, each one more unhinged than the last. Urgent surrender of company assets. Cease and desist immediately. Notice of pending criminal litigation. I clicked on the most recent email and scanned the chaotic blocks of text. Brian was losing his mind. The reality of the $65 million buyout demand I had issued Sunday night had finally set in, and he was violently rejecting it. Instead of accepting defeat and paying the ransom to save his firm, Brian was trying to rely on the only tactic he knew: intimidation. He was throwing every legal buzzword he could think of at the wall, hoping something would stick and terrify me into compliance. He threatened to sue me for corporate sabotage. He accused me of a gross breach of fiduciary duty. He claimed I was engaging in cyber terrorism by holding the valuation algorithm hostage. He demanded I report to the Sterling Capital building immediately to hand over the master password sign over the LLC ownership for free, and apologize to the board, or he would personally see to it that I spent the next decade in a federal penitentiary. Marcus leaned over my shoulder, reading the frantic threats on my screen. He let out a deep, rumbling laugh that vibrated in his chest. "The man is completely unraveling," Marcus noted, taking a sip of his espresso. "He is trying to bully his way out of a bulletproof contract because his ego cannot handle the fact that he got outplayed by a project manager he fired on a Friday afternoon. What is your next move, Camille?" I did not type out a defensive, emotional reply. I did not justify my actions or attempt to argue with his ridiculous claims of cyber terrorism. I simply opened my calendar, generated a secure video conference link, pasted it into a blank email, and sent it to Brian, Trevor, and Valerie, the lead counsel for Sterling Capital. I did not have to wait long. Within exactly 45 seconds, the notification popped up on my screen indicating 3 participants were waiting in the virtual lobby. I set my coffee cup down, adjusted the angle of my laptop camera to perfectly capture the imposing ultra-modern Apex Tech boardroom behind me, and clicked Admit. The screen split into a grid of 3 video feeds. Trevor was in the bottom left corner. He was sitting in a sterile, windowless human resources conference room. He looked absolutely atrocious. His skin was a pale, sickly gray, and his eyes were bloodshot and heavily bagged, confirming he had not slept a single second since his public execution at my parents' house. His tie was missing, his collar was unbuttoned, and he was sweating profusely, frequently wiping his upper lip with the back of his trembling hand. Brian Sterling occupied the top half of the screen. He was sitting in his lavish corner office, but he looked completely unhinged. His face was a dangerous mottled purple. The veins in his neck were bulging, and he was leaning so close to his webcam that his features were distorted. Valerie was in the bottom right corner. As the fierce lead counsel for Sterling Capital, Valerie was a woman who did not tolerate incompetence. She looked exhausted, rubbing her temples with a manicured hand, her expression one of deep, profound irritation. Before I could even offer a polite greeting, Brian launched into a vitriolic tirade. The audio feed crackled as he screamed into his microphone. "You malicious, ungrateful, insubordinate little thief!" Brian roared, spittle flying from his lips and hitting his camera lens. "Who do you think you are dealing with? Do you honestly believe you can extort $65 million from my firm? I will have you arrested before lunch. I have my legal team drafting the federal charges right now. You are going to transfer that patent back to Sterling Capital this exact second, and you are going to beg me not to ruin your entire life. You breached your fiduciary duty. You sabotaged our servers. You stole proprietary company property." I sat perfectly still, letting his rage wash over me without blinking. I did not interrupt him. I let him expend his energy, letting his frantic threats echo in Marcus' quiet office. I glanced at Trevor Feed. Trevor was staring down at his lap, looking physically ill, completely unable to meet my eyes through the screen. Brian slammed his fist down on his desk, the sound exploding through my laptop speakers. "You are a glorified secretary, Camille. You do not own that code. Sterling Capital owns everything you create while on our payroll. Now give me the passwords before I call the police." I opened my mouth to respond, to calmly explain the realities of independent LLC registration, but I did not have to. "Brian, shut your mouth and sit down." The sharp, authoritative voice sliced through the digital feed like a scalpel. Brian snapped his mouth shut, his eyes darting to the bottom right corner of his screen. Valerie unmuted her microphone. She did not look at Brian. She stared directly into her camera, her face set in lines of absolute unyielding fury. She had spent the entire weekend auditing the Apex Tech merger documents, reviewing my employment contract, and digging through the specific licensing agreements I had embedded into the architecture of the deal. She knew the truth, and she was entirely out of patience for Brian's aggressive delusions. "She did not sabotage us, Brian." Valerie stated, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. Brian bristled, leaning forward again. "Valerie, what the hell are you talking about? She locked us out of our own acquisition. She committed corporate espionage." "You arrogant, short-sighted fool!" Valerie snapped, her professional composure finally breaking. "She did not hack the servers. She did not steal anything. The code automatically locked us out because you terminated the licensing agreement. You fired her on Friday afternoon to avoid paying her the $5 million bonus she rightfully earned. You listened to that sweating idiot Trevor because you wanted a cheap victory. And in doing so, you explicitly activated a standard protective clause that you were too arrogant to let me review before you signed the final termination paperwork." Trevor flinched visibly on camera, shrinking down in his cheap plastic chair as Valerie directed her rage toward him. "She legally owns the intellectual property," Valerie continued, her tone relentless. "I spent the last 48 hours tearing apart every single document she ever signed with this firm. She incorporated a private LLC 3 years ago. She holds the sole patent for the valuation algorithm. We never owned it. We were only renting it. and the rental agreement explicitly stated that our access was contingent on her active employment. You fired her without cause. You broke the lease. Brian's face drained of its purple rage, replaced by a sudden sickening pallor. He looked at Valerie, then looked at me, the terrifying reality of his situation finally piercing through his massive ego. "But we can sue her." Brian stammered, his voice losing all of its commanding volume. "We can bury her in court. We can bleed her out with legal fees until she surrenders the patent." Valerie let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Sue her for what, Brian? For enforcing a legally binding contract that you signed. She has us by the throat. Apex Tech has already triggered their key person clause. They are currently drafting a $50 million breach of contract lawsuit against us as we speak. If that merger collapses, our stock price will plummet, the board will demand your immediate resignation, and Sterling Capital will be facing total insolvency by the end of the fiscal quarter." The silence on the video call was absolute. The only sound was Trevor's shallow, panicked breathing echoing through his microphone. "Any judge in this state will laugh you out of court." Brian Valerie delivered the final crushing blow. "You have absolutely no legal standing. None. You cannot bully your way out of this. She holds the patent, she holds the leverage, and she holds the entire future of this firm in the palm of her hand. You are not going to call the police, and you are not going to sue her. You are going to authorize the transfer of $65 million into her holding account before the banking window closes today, or this firm is dead." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the glass desk. I looked directly into Brian. Panicked, defeated eyes. "Are we ready to discuss the wiring instructions, Brian?" I asked softly, a sharp smile playing on my lips. "Or do you need me to transfer you to Marcus Vance so he can officially pull the Apex merger right now?" The $65 million had officially cleared my holding account by Tuesday afternoon. The wire transfer was a silent digital testament to my absolute victory over Brian Sterling Trevor and the entire corrupt executive board at Sterling Capital. I was sitting at the massive quartz island in my downtown condo, sipping a glass of incredibly expensive Pinot Noir, watching the city lights of Atlanta flicker to life through my floor-to-ceiling windows. I had spent the entire day ignoring frantic, escalating voicemails from my parents and a barrage of desperate text messages from unknown numbers. I was finally at peace, safely insulated in the fortress I had paid for with my own brilliance. Then the security intercom mounted on the wall chimed with a harsh, demanding buzz. I set my wine glass down and walked over to the screen. It was Marcus, the evening concierge for my building. He looked incredibly stressed, his eyes darting off camera. "Miss Washington." "I am so sorry to disturb you," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a hushed, apologetic tone. "Your sister is down here in the lobby. She is completely inconsolable. She is crying hysterically and making quite a scene. She says it is an absolute family emergency and that she needs to see you immediately. I was going to call security to escort her out, but she is shaking so badly I was worried she might need medical attention." I stared at the grainy security feed. I could just barely see the edge of Jada designer trench coat as she presumably leaned against the front desk, sobbing for an audience. I let out a long, exhausted breath. I did not want the police called to my building, and I certainly did not want Jada putting on a theatrical performance for my wealthy neighbors. "Send her up, Marcus," I replied smoothly. "But under no circumstances is anyone else allowed up here tonight. If a man tries to follow her into the elevator, lock down the lobby." "Understood, Miss Washington," he said, sounding profoundly relieved to pass the problem off to me. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled open the heavy oak door of my condo, waiting for the private elevator to arrive at the penthouse level. A minute later, the metal door slid open. Jada stumbled out. She was the very picture of a broken woman. Her chest was heaving with loud, dramatic sobs. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her meticulously applied makeup and leaving dark streaks of mascara trailing down her cheeks. She was clutching her leather handbag to her chest like a life preserver. "Camille?" she wailed, her voice cracking pitifully. "Camille, please, you have to talk to me. You have to listen to me." I stepped back, allowing her to cross the threshold into my foyer. The moment her expensive heels cleared the entryway, I pushed the heavy oak door shut. The deadbolt clicked into place with a sharp metallic thud, sealing us inside the quiet luxury of my home. The transition was instantaneous and entirely chilling. The moment the lock clicked, Jada's loud, racking sobs ceased immediately. The tears miraculously stopped flowing. Her trembling shoulders snapped back into a posture of rigid, arrogant entitlement. She reached up, casually wiping the ruined mascara from under her eyes with the back of her hand, completely abandoning the hysterical victim routine she had just used to bypass my concierge. She looked around my pristine, ultra-modern living room, her eyes raking over the expensive contemporary art and the custom furniture with naked, malicious disdain. "You think you are so smart?" Jada sneered, her voice completely devoid of the fragile sorrow she had projected seconds ago. Her tone was vicious, sharp, and dripping with venom. "You think you can just destroy my husband's career, humiliate my family, and hide up here in your little glass tower while my life falls apart?" I crossed my arms over my chest, leaning casually against the hallway wall. "You deserve an Academy Award for that performance in the lobby, Jada. Truly spectacular. What do you want?" "I am not giving Trevor a dime, and I am certainly not giving him the credit for my software. So if you came here to beg on his behalf, you can turn right around and get back in the elevator." Jada dropped her designer handbag onto my entryway table with a heavy thud. She unzipped the main compartment and pulled out a thick stack of stapled legal documents. She shoved the papers directly at my chest, forcing me to take them or let them hit the floor. I grabbed the thick packet, glancing at the cover page. It was a retroactive intellectual property waiver hastily drafted by some cut-rate defense attorney. "You are going to sign that waiver right now," Jada demanded, her voice rising to a shrill, commanding pitch. "You are going to backdate your signature to last Thursday." The waiver clearly states that Trevor was an equal co-creator of the Apex valuation algorithm. It states that you acted as a rogue, disgruntled agent when you locked the servers, and it legally transfers 50% of the $65 million buyout directly into Trevor's personal holding accounts. I stared at her, genuinely astounded by the sheer, unadulterated delusion radiating from her face. "You cannot possibly be serious." I let out a dry, incredulous laugh, tossing the legal packet onto the table next to her bag. "The ink is barely dry on the wire transfer from Brian Sterling. Apex Tech already knows the truth. Trevor is blacklisted. A fake backdated document is not going to magically reinstate his vice president title or buy your ridiculous mansion in Alpharetta. The money is mine. The patent is mine. Trevor is a fraud." Jada took a step closer to me, invading my personal space. Her eyes were wide, burning with a frantic, malicious desperation. "The Alpharetta house is gone, Camille." She shrieked, the reality of her failure finally making her voice tremble with genuine rage. "The builders canceled our contract this morning because Trevor escrow check bounced. My country club membership is suspended. Trevor is facing total financial ruin, and it is entirely your fault. You are destroying my life out of petty, bitter jealousy. But I am not going to let you win. If you do not sign that waiver right now and save my husband's reputation, I am going to the police tomorrow morning." I tilted my head, looking at her with cold amusement. "You are going to the police to report what exactly?" "That I legally sold a product I invented to a willing buyer. That is not a crime, Jada. It is called capitalism." "No," Jada whispered, a twisted, triumphant smile spreading across her face. Her voice dropped into a dark, venomous register. "Trevor and I are going to the police to report a massive, systematic financial crime. We are going to tell the authorities that Trevor Bonus was never going to buy my custom house. We are going to tell them the truth. That bonus was supposed to quietly replace the $300,000 that was embezzled from mom and dad retirement accounts." I narrowed my eyes. "I already exposed Trevor for embezzling that money, Jada. Kenneth and Yvonne know exactly what he did. You are threatening to report your own husband for grand larceny. We are not going to tell the police that Trevor stole it." Jada spat, her eyes locking onto mine with an unhinged intensity. "We are going to tell them that you stole it, Camille." The silence in the foyer was heavy and oppressive. I stared at my sister, processing the absolute depths of her depravity. Think about it, Camille. Jada continued, her voice gaining a sickening, frantic momentum. Trevor and I spent all of last night manufacturing the perfect digital paper trail. We fabricated consultation invoices. We forged email threads. We are going to hand over a perfectly packaged narrative proving that Trevor hired your new LLC to audit his app. We will tell the detectives that you used that access to illegally siphon $300,000 from mom and dad offshore accounts, filtering it right through Trevor, failing startup to cover your tracks. She took another aggressive step forward, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. You are the financial architect, Camille, Jada hissed. You are the genius. You are the one who knows how to bypass biometric security protocols. You literally just proved to the entire corporate world that you know how to lock down servers, manipulate digital assets, and extort multi-million-dollar companies. Trevor is just a simple app developer. He does not have the technical background to orchestrate a complex offshore embezzlement scheme. But you do. You had access to their accounts in the past. You just registered a brand new LLC right before the money went missing. The timeline is incredibly suspicious. It is a desperate, sloppy plan, but it is plausible enough to warrant a massive federal investigation. We will ruin you. I looked at her, feeling a cold, heavy stone drop into the pit of my stomach. She was fully prepared to send her own sister to federal prison. She was willing to orchestrate a massive criminal conspiracy to frame me for a felony, all to protect the bruised ego of the white man who had lied to her and robbed our parents blind. You actually think the police are going to look at a pile of forged, poorly manufactured invoices and believe that I stole from our parents? I asked, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Kenneth and Yvonne will never corroborate that story. They know Trevor took the money. Jada let out a cruel, mocking laugh. Mom and Dad will do whatever I tell them to do to protect the family reputation, she sneered. They will back Trevor up because Trevor is supposed to be the success story. But that does not even matter. Do you honestly not understand how the real world works, Camille? She leaned in, her face twisted with an ugly, visceral malice. She dropped the ultimate racially charged ultimatum, weaponizing our very existence against me. Who do you think the police will believe? Camille, Jada whispered, her words dripping with a toxic, terrifying certainty. Who do you think a judge will sympathize with? A successful, charming, white tech executive from a good family who claims he was duped by his deceptive sister-in-law? Or the bitter, aggressive, single black woman who was just unceremoniously fired for insubordination and corporate sabotage? The words hung in the air between us, ugly and suffocating. You fit the profile perfectly. Jada continued, reveling in the horrific reality of the societal prejudice she was actively trying to exploit. You fit the exact stereotype of a disgruntled criminal employee. You are abrasive, you are arrogant, you are isolated. The authorities will look at Trevor and they will see a victim. They will look at you and they will see a threat. We will hand them the narrative on a silver platter and they will swallow it whole because it confirms every bias they already have. I did not scream. I did not raise my hand to strike her, even though every instinct in my body demanded violence. I stood perfectly still, letting the absolute monstrosity of her threat settle over me. Jada was fully aware of the systemic racism that endangered black women every single day, and she was deliberately using it as a weapon to destroy my life. She was prioritizing her proximity to whiteness, prioritizing her suburban illusions over my freedom and my humanity. Sign the waiver, Camille, Jada demanded, tapping the legal packet on the table. Give Trevor the patent, give him half the money, and we will walk away. If you refuse, I am calling the police the second I step out of your building, and I will personally watch them drag you out of this penthouse in handcuffs. I looked at my sister, the girl I had shared a childhood with, the woman my parents had always protected. I did not see family anymore. I saw a dangerous, unhinged enemy standing in my foyer, and I knew with absolute terrifying clarity exactly what I had to do to survive. I did not scream. I did not weep. I did not fall to my knees and beg my sister for mercy. Instead, I let out a low, genuine laugh that echoed brightly against the high ceilings of my foyer. Jada flinched, her malicious smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. She had expected terror. She had expected me to crumble under the weight of her meticulously calculated threat. The utter lack of fear in my response clearly unsettled her, but she quickly masked her hesitation with a glare of pure, concentrated venom. "You think this is funny, Camille?" Jada hissed, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "You think federal prison is a joke? I am giving you one chance to save yourself. Sign the waiver." I did not answer her immediately. I pushed myself off the wall, maintaining an aura of total, effortless calm. I walked right past her, entirely ignoring the stapled legal documents sitting on my entryway table. I moved into the center of my ultra-modern living room, the city lights of Atlanta pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows and casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. I picked up my phone from the massive quartz kitchen island. "You really thought you had me cornered, Jada," I said, tapping the screen of my device with deliberate precision. "You actually believed that your proximity to whiteness, your little country club membership, and your pristine suburban facade made you untouchable. You thought you could weaponize the very real systemic dangers that Black women face in this country and use them against your own sister to protect a man who robbed our parents blind. It is a brilliant, vicious plan. It truly is." I turned around to face her, holding my phone up. "There is just one massive, catastrophic flaw in your logic," I continued, my voice dropping into a register of absolute terrifying authority. "You forgot who I am. You forgot that I write security protocols for multi-billion-dollar tech acquisitions. Do you honestly think a single Black woman living alone in a luxury downtown penthouse does not have a state-of-the-art surveillance system?" With a swift swipe of my finger, I activated the screen mirroring function on my phone. Instantly, the massive 80-inch flat-screen smart TV mounted on my living room wall flickered to life. The sudden burst of light illuminated the dark room. High-definition, crystal-clear video filled the massive screen. It was a perfectly angled shot from the hidden camera, seamlessly integrated into my foyer ceiling. Jada gasped, her body jolting backward as if she had been physically struck. The audio kicked in a second later, crisp and perfectly calibrated, echoing through my premium surround sound speakers. My sister's own voice filled the living room, loud and unmistakable. "Trevor and I spent all of last night manufacturing the perfect digital paper trail. We fabricated consultation invoices. We forged email threads." The digital version of Jada paced aggressively across the screen, jabbing a finger toward the camera lens. "We will tell the detectives that you used that access to illegally siphon $300,000 from mom and dad offshore accounts, filtering it right through Trevor failing startup to cover your tracks." I stood in the center of the living room, watching the color rapidly drain from Jada's face until her skin was an ashen, sickly gray. Her jaw dropped open, her eyes wide with a frantic, uncomprehending horror as she watched herself commit textbook extortion in stunning 4K resolution. She looked from the television screen to my phone, her chest heaving in rapid, shallow breaths. "Who do you think the police will believe, Camille?" The digital Jada whispered through the speakers, her words dripping with a toxic, terrifying certainty. "A successful, charming white tech executive from a good family, who claims he was duped by his deceptive sister-in-law. Or the bitter, aggressive single Black woman who was just unceremoniously fired for insubordination and corporate sabotage." I tapped my screen again, pausing the video right on a freeze frame of Jada's face, twisted into an ugly, malicious sneer. The sudden silence in the condo was heavy and absolute. I looked at my sister, watching her entire fabricated reality implode for the second time in 48 hours. "Smile for the camera, Jada," I said, offering her a cold, victorious smile. "You just explicitly confessed to conspiracy to commit fraud, extortion, and the framing of an innocent person. You also formally admitted on a crystal-clear audio recording that Trevor embezzled $300,000 from Kenneth and Yvonne retirement accounts. You just handed me the murder weapon and perfectly outlined your entire criminal intent." Jada's hands were shaking so violently she could barely keep them at her sides. She took a step toward me, her eyes wild with a manic, cornered desperation. "Camille, please," she stammered, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Delete it. You have to delete it. I was just angry. I did not mean it. I was just trying to protect my husband. Delete it." I asked, raising an eyebrow in feigned surprise. "Jada, this is a synchronized security matrix. The moment you started screaming in my foyer, this footage was automatically encrypted and backed up to 3 separate secure offshore cloud servers. I could drop this phone into the Chattahoochee River right now, and my legal team would still have full access to the original files. You cannot unring this bell. She let out a strangled, breathless sob, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. The arrogant, entitled woman who had tried to destroy my life was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified, hollow shell. She realized with absolute certainty that her perfect life was over. There would be no custom house in Alpharetta. There would be no vice president lifestyle. There was only the looming, inescapable threat of federal prison. I walked slowly toward the entryway, stopping just a few feet away from where she stood, frozen in terror. I pointed a single finger directly at the heavy oak front door. "You have exactly 30 seconds to get out of my home," I ordered, my voice ringing with an icy, unforgiving finality. Jada lunged forward, frantically reaching for the thick packet of legal documents she had dropped onto the entryway table. "Leave the papers," I barked, the sharp command echoing off the walls. I slapped my hand down on top of the packet, pinning it to the table before she could grab it. "These are evidence now. They stay with me." She recoiled, snatching her hand back as if the documents had burned her. "If you or Trevor ever contact me again," I continued, leaning in close so she could hear the absolute promise in my voice. "If you ever show up at my building, if you ever try to speak to my clients, or if you ever breathe a single word of your pathetic little conspiracy to Kenneth and Yvonne, I will not hesitate. I will send this high-definition footage along with these fraudulent legal documents directly to the FBI White-Collar Crime Division. I will let them know exactly how Trevor funded his app, and I will let them watch you confess to the entire scheme. Now get out." Jada did not argue. She did not attempt another manipulation. She grabbed her designer handbag with trembling hands, practically tripping over her own expensive heels as she scrambled backward toward the door. She fumbled wildly with the deadbolt, her breath coming in ragged, panicking gasps. She yanked the heavy door open and threw herself into the hallway, rushing blindly toward the private elevator. I stepped forward and slammed the door shut behind her. The heavy oak frame vibrated with the force of the impact, sealing me back inside my silent, secure fortress. I threw the deadbolt, listening to the satisfying metallic click of absolute safety. I stood in the quiet foyer for a long moment, letting the adrenaline slowly drain from my system. The battle was over. The toxic, suffocating anchor of my family had been completely and legally severed. I walked back into the living room, picking up my glass of Pinot Noir from the kitchen island. I took a slow, celebratory sip, enjoying the rich, complex flavors settling on my tongue. Suddenly, my phone vibrated violently against the quartz countertop. A sharp, distinct notification chime echoed through the silent condo. I picked up the device and looked at the screen. A breaking news alert from Bloomberg Finance was flashing brightly across the display. Sterling Capital shares plunge 20% in after-hours trading. Rumors leak of $50 million Apex Tech acquisition collapse. Insiders cite massive intellectual property dispute and pending litigation. I smiled, watching the digital confirmation of Brian Sterling total destruction roll across my screen. The financial sector was reacting exactly as Valerie had predicted. The predators smelled blood in the water, and Sterling Capital was bleeding out. Before the Bloomberg alert could even fade from the screen, my phone vibrated again. An incoming call replaced the news banner. The caller ID displayed a private number, but I knew exactly who it was. The timing was too perfect. I swiped the green button, answering the call and raising the phone to my ear. I did not say a word. I simply waited. The heavy, ragged sound of a man trying to catch his breath filled the speaker. When Brian Sterling finally spoke, his voice was completely unrecognizable. The booming, arrogant corporate conqueror who had fired me on a Friday afternoon was entirely gone. He sounded small, frail, and utterly terrified. "What do you want, Camille?" Brian whispered, his voice trembling so badly it cracked over the line. "Name your price. Just please call Apex Tech and stop this. What do you want?" The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind Trevor, sealing his fate and leaving a profound, suffocating silence in the room. The corporate sharks had devoured their own, leaving nothing but the metallic scratch of Brian's silver pen echoing through the boardroom. Brian scrawled his signature across the dotted line, his hand trembling so violently that the ink jagged across the page. He flipped to the final addendum, initialed the immediate transfer authorization, and pushed the thick packet back toward the center of the table. He looked up, his eyes hollowed out, carrying the heavy, humiliating weight of a man who had just been publicly brought to his knees by the woman he thought he could discard. "It's done," Brian rasped, pushing away from the table. "The 15 million is wired. Trevor is gone. Now release the code, Camille. Save my firm." I didn't reach for the contract. I simply nodded to one of the senior litigators standing over my left shoulder. He stepped forward seamlessly, retrieving the signed documents and sliding them into his leather briefcase with a satisfying snap. I pulled my phone from my pocket, opening the secure Apex Tech encrypted portal Marcus had set up for me that morning. With 3 deliberate taps of my thumb, I bypassed the biometric locks, accessed the core valuation architecture, and manually disengaged the firewall. "The algorithm is live," I announced, my voice cool and even. "Your servers are unlocked. The acquisition can proceed." Marcus Vance let out a low, approving chuckle, checking the confirmation ping on his own device. He looked around the boardroom, his gaze sweeping over the terrified, exhausted executives with a predator's satisfaction. "It has been a pleasure doing business with you, gentlemen," Marcus said, his tone dripping with polished sarcasm. "I look forward to finalizing the merger. Assuming, of course, you manage to keep the rest of your house in order." I didn't offer Brian a parting glance. I didn't need to gloat or deliver a dramatic final speech. The $15 million clearing my offshore holding account and the smoking crater of Trevor's career were all the statements I needed to make. I turned on my heel, the sharp click of my crimson stilettos ringing out like a judge's gavel, and walked out of the boardroom with my legal team and Marcus Vance trailing in my wake. The ride down the private executive elevator was glorious. I watched the floor numbers descend, feeling lighter than I had in years. The oppressive, suffocating weight of sterling capital, of my family's expectations, of Trevor's unearned arrogance, it was all gone. "Brilliant execution, Camille," Marcus said, stepping out into the sunlit lobby and adjusting his cuffs. "You didn't just back them into a corner, you made them build their own cage. If you ever get tired of independent consulting, there's a corner office at Apex waiting for you. Name your price." "I'll keep that in mind, Marcus," I replied, a genuine smile breaking across my face for the first time that morning. "But I think I'm going to enjoy being my own boss for a while." I stepped out onto the bustling Atlanta street, the midday sun warming the sharp crimson silk of my suit. The city felt entirely different now. It was no longer a battlefield. It was my kingdom. As I walked toward my waiting car, my phone vibrated in my pocket. The screen flashed with a barrage of notifications. Kenneth and Yvonne were calling back to back, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails. Jada was texting in all caps, her messages a chaotic spiral of rage, panic, and desperate apologies. Trevor was officially unemployed. Their Alpharetta mansion was a ghost, and the fallout of their embezzlement scheme was about to tear the family apart. I silenced the phone and slipped it back into my pocket, slipping on a pair of dark sunglasses. The transfer is complete, and Camille walks out of Sterling Capital $15 million richer, leaving her enemies in the dust. Would you like to see how she handles her parents and Jada, now that she holds all the cards? Or should we skip ahead to a scene where she officially launches her own independent tech empire? The sun rose over Atlanta on Monday morning, casting a sharp, blinding glare against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Apex Tech headquarters in Midtown. I was not at home hiding under my covers. I was not screening calls from my furious parents or panicking over the bridge I had just burned to ashes. Instead, I was sitting in a plush leather chair in the ultra-modern glass-walled office of Marcus Vance. Marcus was the visionary chief executive officer of Apex Tech. He was a man who appreciated precision, efficiency, and above all else, absolute ruthlessness in business. He stood by his personal espresso machine, meticulously pulling 2 shots of dark roast. He handed me a matte black ceramic cup, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. Marcus had always known Trevor was a fraud. During the 14 months we spent negotiating the merger, Marcus had watched Trevor stumble through basic financial models and deflect technical questions. Marcus had seen right through the tailored suits and the hollow corporate buzzwords. He knew I was the one writing the code, running the projections, and holding the architecture of the deal together. When I called Marcus late Sunday night to inform him that Sterling Capital had officially fired me and that I had subsequently locked down the proprietary valuation algorithm, he did not panic. He did not threaten to pull the acquisition. He simply invited me to his office for morning coffee to watch the fallout. I took a slow sip of the rich, bitter espresso, savoring the warmth as it traveled down my throat. The quiet hum of the Apex Tech executive floor was a stark, soothing contrast to the hysterical screaming that had echoed through my parents' grand dining room the night before. "You played them perfectly," Camille Marcus said, taking a seat behind his massive glass desk. "Brian Sterling is a dinosaur. He operates on intimidation and theft. He genuinely believed he could snatch your life work, hand it to that incompetent brother-in-law of yours, and toss you out into the street without a second thought. He entirely underestimated who he was dealing with. I have my legal team standing by. Whenever you are ready to formally sever ties with Sterling Capital, Apex Tech is prepared to acquire your algorithm directly." I smiled, resting the ceramic cup on my knee. Brian is about to realize that his cheap attempt to save a $5 million commission is going to cost him his entire firm. Right on cue, my laptop resting on Marcus' sleek desk chimed with a frantic, repetitive rhythm. A cascade of notification banners flooded the top right corner of my screen. It was a relentless digital assault from Brian Sterling. I opened my inbox to find a barrage of emails, each subject line typed entirely in capital letters, each one more unhinged than the last. Urgent surrender of company assets, cease and desist immediately, notice of pending criminal litigation. I clicked on the most recent email and scanned the chaotic blocks of text. Brian was losing his mind. The reality of the server lockout had finally set in, and he was violently rejecting it. Instead of accepting defeat and attempting to negotiate professionally, Brian was relying on the only tactic he knew. He was throwing every aggressive legal threat he could think of at the wall, hoping something would stick and terrify me into compliance. He explicitly threatened to sue me for corporate sabotage. He accused me of a gross breach of fiduciary duty. He claimed I was engaging in cyber terrorism by holding the Apex Tech valuation algorithm hostage. He demanded I report to the Sterling Capital building immediately to hand over the master passwords and sign a full surrender of my intellectual property. He promised that if I did not comply by noon, he would personally see to it that I spent the next decade in a federal penitentiary. Marcus leaned over my shoulder, reading the frantic threats on my screen. He let out a deep, rumbling laugh that vibrated in his chest. "The man is completely unraveling," Marcus noted. "He is trying to bully his way out of a bulletproof situation because his fragile ego cannot handle the fact that he got outplayed by the very woman he tried to cheat. What is your next move?" I did not type out a defensive, emotional reply. I did not justify my actions or attempt to argue with his ridiculous claims of cyber terrorism. I simply opened my calendar, generated a secure video conference link, pasted it into a blank email, and sent it to Brian, Trevor, and Valerie. Valerie was the lead counsel for Sterling Capital. She was a brilliant cutthroat lawyer who despised Brian and his arrogant management style. I knew that if anyone at that firm was going to understand the absolute legal nightmare Brian had just created, it would be her. I did not have to wait long. Within exactly 45 seconds, the notification popped up on my screen indicating 3 participants were waiting in the virtual lobby. I set my coffee cup down, adjusted the angle of my laptop camera to perfectly capture the imposing Apex Tech boardroom behind me, and clicked Admit. The screen split into a grid of 3 video feeds. Trevor was in the bottom left corner. He was sitting in a sterile, windowless human resources conference room. He looked absolutely atrocious. His skin was a pale, sickly gray, and his eyes were bloodshot and heavily bagged, confirming he had not slept a single second since his public execution at my parents' house. His tie was missing, his collar was unbuttoned, and he was sweating profusely, frequently wiping his upper lip with the back of his trembling hand. He looked exactly like a man who knew his embezzlement had been exposed and his career was entirely over. Brian Sterling occupied the top half of the screen. He was sitting in his lavish corner office, but he looked completely unhinged. His face was a dangerous, mottled purple. The veins in his neck were bulging, and he was leaning so close to his webcam that his features were distorted. Valerie was in the bottom right corner. As the fierce lead counsel, she looked sharp but intensely exhausted. She was rubbing her temples with a manicured hand, her expression one of deep, profound irritation. She had clearly been dealing with Brian's screaming all morning. Before I could even offer a polite greeting, Brian launched into a vitriolic tirade. The audio feed crackled as he screamed into his microphone. "You malicious, ungrateful, insubordinate little thief!" Brian roared, spittle flying from his lips and hitting his camera lens. "Who do you think you are dealing with? Do you honestly believe you can extort my firm? I will have you arrested before lunch. I have my legal team drafting the federal charges right now. You are going to unlock those servers this exact second, and you are going to beg me not to ruin your entire life. You breached your fiduciary duty. You sabotaged our systems. You stole proprietary company property." I sat perfectly still, letting his rage wash over me without blinking. I did not interrupt him. I let him expend his energy, letting his frantic threats echo in Marcus' quiet office. I glanced at Trevor Feed. Trevor was staring down at his lap, looking physically ill, completely unable to meet my eyes through the screen. Brian slammed his fist down on his desk, the sound exploding through my laptop speakers. "You are a glorified project manager, Camille. You do not own that code. Sterling Capital owns everything you create while on our payroll. Now give me the passwords before I call the police." I opened my mouth to respond, to calmly explain the realities of independent intellectual property registration, but I did not have to say a single word. "Brian, shut your mouth and sit down." The sharp, authoritative voice sliced through the digital feed like a scalpel. Brian snapped his mouth shut, his eyes darting to the bottom right corner of his screen. Valerie unmuted her microphone. She did not look at Brian. She stared directly into her camera, her face set in lines of absolute, unyielding fury. She had spent the entire weekend auditing the Apex Tech merger documents, reviewing my employment contract, and digging through the specific licensing agreements I had embedded into the architecture of the deal. She knew the truth, and she was entirely out of patience for Brian and his aggressive delusions. "She did not sabotage us, Brian," Valerie stated, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. Brian bristled, leaning forward again. "Valerie, what the hell are you talking about? She locked us out of our own acquisition. She committed corporate espionage." "You arrogant, short-sighted fool!" Valerie snapped, her professional composure finally breaking. She looked directly into her camera and delivered the absolute, undeniable truth. "She didn't sabotage us, Brian. You fired her to avoid paying her the $5 million, and in doing so, you activated a standard protective clause that you were too arrogant to let me review. She legally owns the IP. She has us by the throat, and any judge will laugh you out of court." The silence on the video call was absolute. The only sound was Trevor's shallow, panicked breathing, echoing through his microphone. Brian's face drained of its purple rage, replaced by a sudden, sickening pallor. He looked at Valerie, then looked at me, the terrifying reality of his situation finally piercing through his massive ego. He had tried to play God with my career, and he had accidentally handed me the keys to his entire kingdom. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the glass desk. I looked directly into Brian, panicked, defeated eyes, allowing a slow, triumphant smile to touch my lips. The silence stretched out thick and suffocating as the most powerful men in the room realized they were completely and utterly powerless. Exactly 30 days later, the air in Atlanta felt distinctly different. It was lighter, sharper, and entirely mine. I sat back in my custom ergonomic leather chair, letting the smooth, cool material contour perfectly to my spine. The chaotic, suffocating energy of Sterling Capital was nothing but a distant, fading memory, replaced by the sleek, high-altitude silence of my new reality. I was no longer a disposable project manager, fighting for basic respect in a toxic boys' club. I was officially a managing partner at Apex Tech. My expansive corner office on the 60th floor was a masterclass in modern power. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around two sides of the massive room, offering an unobstructed panoramic view of the sprawling city skyline. A polished obsidian desk anchored the space free of clutter, holding only a state-of-the-art multi-monitor display and a crystal carafe of sparkling water. Marcus Vance had kept every single one of his promises, recognizing that the architect of his most lucrative acquisition deserved a throne of her own. I had my own dedicated team of analysts, complete creative autonomy over our new valuation algorithms, and a level of professional respect I had once thought impossible to achieve. I took a slow sip of my iced matcha, enjoying the quiet hum of the climate control system. I was in the middle of reviewing a highly lucrative merger proposal for a European tech conglomerate when the harsh, vibrating buzz of my personal cell phone shattered the tranquility of my office. I glanced down at the glowing screen resting on my desk. The caller ID displayed a name I had not seen nor thought about in exactly 1 month. Yvonne. I stared at the incoming call for a long moment. A month ago, a call from my mother would have sent a spike of anxiety directly through my chest. I would have braced myself for the inevitable barrage of criticism, the passive-aggressive remarks about my career, or another glowing, unsolicited update about Jada's perfect suburban life. Now, looking at the flashing name, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical curiosity. The victor deciding whether to grant an audience to the vanquished. I tapped the green icon and brought the phone to my ear, remaining perfectly silent. A ragged, wretched sound spilled through the speaker. It was not the sharp, authoritative voice of the haughty matriarch who used to dictate family dinners with an iron fist. It was the sound of uncontrollable, hyperventilating weeping. Yvonne was sobbing so violently that she could barely catch her breath, her composure entirely shattered. Camille, her voice cracked, high-pitched and frantic. "Camille, please tell me you are there. Please do not hang up on me." I swiveled my chair slightly, gazing out at the sun reflecting off the glass skyscrapers downtown. "I am here," I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion. The dam broke, and the catastrophic reality of my family's downfall poured out of the speaker in a frantic, hysterical rush. The pristine artificial world they had built their entire identities around had completely collapsed. "It is Trevor," Yvonne wailed, her breath hitching painfully. "The FBI raided their house in Alpharetta 3 days ago. Men in windbreakers took boxes of files, computers, everything. He is under federal investigation for massive corporate fraud and wire tampering. They say he was running a shadow network for years. Jada is completely beside herself. The bank locked them out. The custom house is in foreclosure, Camille. They taped a bright green notice right to the front door for the entire neighborhood to see." I listened to the destruction of my sister's manufactured empire, feeling the cool condensation forming on the outside of my matcha glass. Trevor had flown too close to the sun, fueled by arrogance and a false sense of invincibility, and now his wings had completely melted. But Yvonne was not finished. The true tragedy, the reason she was reduced to begging on my personal line, was yet to come. "It is your father," she sobbed, a fresh wave of panic ripping through her words. "Kenneth is ruined." When Brian Sterling fired Trevor, Kenneth panicked. He was so terrified of the social embarrassment, so obsessed with protecting Trevor's reputation as the golden son-in-law, that he made a catastrophic mistake. He secretly co-signed a series of massive fraudulent business loans to help Trevor cover his tracks and quickly launch a new venture. My grip tightened slightly on my phone. Kenneth, the man who had called my career a foolish hobby, had blindly signed his name to federal crimes just to protect the illusion of a successful white son-in-law. When the feds seized Trevor's assets, they followed the paper trail right back to your father. Yvonne cried, her voice dropping to a devastated whisper. "They froze everything, Camille. Kenneth's retirement accounts, his investment portfolios, our joint checking accounts. It is all locked down by the federal government. We have absolutely nothing." The sheer monumental scale of their self-inflicted ruin hung heavily in the air. They had chosen the charming manipulator over their own loyal daughter, and that choice had cost them their entire existence. Camille. I am begging you. Yvonne pleaded, her pride completely eviscerated. The country club board is convening tomorrow to formally revoke our membership. The humiliation is going to literally kill your father. We cannot even buy groceries. You have to help us. We need a family loan. Just enough to keep a roof over our heads and save our status in the community while the lawyers sort this out. We know about the Sterling Capital buyout. We know you have the money. Please, Camille. You are our blood. You are our daughter. I sat in the profound silence of my corner office listening to the desperate, pathetic pleas of a woman who had spent my entire life making me feel small, inadequate, and entirely unloved. She did not apologize for letting Trevor frame me. She did not apologize for believing a thief over her own child. Even now, standing in the smoking rubble of her life, her primary concern was saving her country club status. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, my posture relaxed, my voice dripping with an icy absolute calm that commanded total authority. Sorry, Mom. Due to a corporate restructuring of my personal finances, I don't have the space in my portfolio for toxic investments. But I hear Trevor is looking for work. Tell him I'm hiring a junior barista for the lobby downstairs. He can apply online. A sharp, ragged gasp echoed through the speaker. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. In that single breathless moment, Yvonne finally realized that her favorite scapegoat was gone forever, replaced by an untouchable force who owed her absolutely nothing. I did not wait for her to find her voice. I tapped the red button, instantly cutting off the connection and plunging my office back into a brilliant, beautiful silence. I set the phone down on my obsidian desk and smoothly swiped open my banking application. The biometric scanner flashed green and the screen loaded with crisp, high-definition clarity. My eyes traced the bold black numbers displayed across the top of the interface. Available balance $15 million. The funds had fully cleared. The money was clean, secure, and entirely mine. I locked the screen, letting the display fade to black. I stood up from my desk, smoothing the sharp lines of my tailored suit, and walked slowly toward the towering wall of glass. I looked out over the sprawling city, watching the traffic flow like tiny ribbons of light far below my feet. The world was massive, moving, and completely open to whatever I chose to build next. I stood in the quiet triumph of my corner office, entirely free from the chains of my past, and smiled. I finally had exactly what I deserved. Fade to black. The greatest lesson here is that true security never comes from seeking validation from toxic people, even blood relatives. For years, Camille sought approval from a family that only saw her as a scapegoat. It was only when she stopped fighting for their love and started fighting for herself that she truly won. Building your own independence and setting unapologetic boundaries is the ultimate form of self-respect. Sometimes the most empowering thing you can do is walk away and let karma handle the rest. Have you ever cut ties with toxic relatives? Share your story below, like and subscribe today.